We will have 3 speakers for the presentation. The first one is Laura Hum. She is the Chief Operating Officer for SIMmersion. She has a broad background in psychology with specific training and expertise in the design, development, and evaluation of simulation technology used to develop communication skills. During her 18-year tenure with SIMmersion, Laura has led the design and development of 50 training programs, served as program manager or co-investigator on over 20 federal funded grants and she also co-authored 18 publications. The second speaker is Dr. Matthew Smith. Dr. Smith is an associate professor and director of the Level Up Employment Skills Simulation Lab at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. Dr. Smith's research focuses on developing and evaluating technology-based intervention for special education, community mental health agencies, and prisons to enhance employment outcomes among marginalized youth and adults from underserved communities. Dr. Smith's research is funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, National Institute of Justice, Kessler Foundation, and the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research. And the last speaker is Chris Stacy. He is the Chief Business Officer for SIMmersion. His expertise is valuing people within processes to cultivate meaningful relationships between technology developers, research partners, and stakeholders. As co-investigator on several NIH-funded projects, Dr. Stacy has experience with the design, development, adaptation, evaluation, and implementation of evidence-based simulation training tools. His current research interests lie in community-based participatory research methods for the development of simulation training technology. They are going to share a number of projects related to using virtual reality in training people with disabilities in improving their communication skills and how they incorporate the stakeholders' feedback and throughout the process. So the stage is yours, Laura.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Makes me feel very important. My job at SIMmersion is the Chief Operating Officer, as Connie mentioned, and our goal today is to talk about including stakeholder feedback in the design, development, and evaluation of assistive technology, specifically assistive technology to help individuals with disabilities obtain a job and practice that interview process. SIMmersion's focus is developing simulated conversations using people sim technology, and that technology combines the benefits of professional role plays with the convenience of online training. In my job, I work with the customers and the researchers to design and oversee development of products that build skills, but also that focus on creating an engaging experience that learners actually want to use. And that's challenging because you need to make sure that no perspective overshadows any other. And that's what Dr. Smith and Dr. Stacy and I are here to talk to you about. Our research was developed with some funding from the United States National Institutes of Health. Additionally, I'd like to disclose that in addition to my role at SIMmersion, I am a partial owner and Dr. Stacy is a full-time employee. So the research tells us that work improves quality of life. And as Dr. Forber-Pratt shared with us a few speakers ago, individuals with disabilities often struggle to get jobs. Anyone who's ever been on a job interview knows that it's a scary experience, but then add to that the need to determine when is the right time to disclose a disability or when is the right time to ask for an accommodation. Sometimes individuals need to explain gaps in work history because employers tend to like to see a strong work history and background. All of those things can lead to lack of confidence and a misunderstanding of how to be honest about your experience, but also highlight your strengths. So what we did is we partnered with Dr. Morris Bell at Yale, who has research based on supported employment programs that are used to help individuals with disabilities seek opportunities and find the right opportunities for them and help them practice how to do an interview. And he and Dr. Olson from SIMmersion were combining SIMmersion's technology that allows people to practice difficult conversations. So we wanted to make sure that we were based off of the research, things like being professional and showing interest in the job, being positive about your background and your history, while also balancing that with being honest. So we wanted to make sure that we were focusing on that. We also wanted to make sure we were highlighting the technology features that are available. Every interview experience is a little bit different, and the PeopleSim technology actually allows every conversation to look and feel a little bit different, different questions being asked, those sorts of things. And just like in a real interview, the answers that you provide to the questions are going to help build rapport or confidence in the reviewer. Whereas if you make mistakes in the interview or down on yourself, the interviewer is less likely to hire you. So the conversation changes throughout. You may get more questions in one area than another based off of the skills that you're expressing. The technology allows us to do that. The last thing that the technology allows us to do that we wanted to make sure was included in this particular program is that the interviewer's personality can change the tone of the interview. Sometimes you have an interviewer who is very patient and maybe very kind, who kind of helps you out. And if you make a mistake, gives you an opportunity to revise your answer or provide additional content that maybe you missed in your first answer. Then you might have a rushed interviewer who is just really busy and just wants to get through it and is just peppering you with questions. Then, unfortunately, there are some interviewers who maybe don't have a lot of experience and make mistakes or maybe ask illegal or inappropriate questions during the interview. So we wanted to make sure that all of those things were included in the design of the simulation that allowed people to practice interviews before they went in front of an actual interview with a human resource staff member. So as we were combining these features together, we knew we could build a program that would work in a lab setting, but we didn't want to just build a program that sat on a shelf somewhere. We wanted to ensure that individuals with disabilities would use it on their own. So we incorporated a third element in our design, and that was stakeholder input. We created a panel that included not just the technology developers and writers and not just the researchers, but stakeholders as well. Individuals like supported employment coaches and human resources managers and staff. But also we needed to make sure that we included individuals with disabilities themselves within the review panel, because they're the ones who are ultimately going to use it. So they needed to tell us what they needed in the program that was going to help them most. So we pulled this group together and we reviewed the project goals. And then we actually turned the program over to them in a prototype state and let them play through it. They got to have the interviewer ask them questions. They got to see the available answers. They got to see the help coach who was providing them feedback on how well they were doing or what kind of mistakes they were making and how they could change their answers the next time. Based off of that feedback, we adjusted the design and created a new version of the prototype and gave it back to them to review it again. And what we learned from them was mostly what we expected to learn, that the practice with feedback built skills and confidence. The individuals with disabilities really liked the feedback, both the nonverbal thumbs up and thumbs down that the help coach gave, but more importantly, the tips that the coach was giving them about how to adjust their answers and how to move forward so they could change what they're doing. And that in the moment feedback was really helpful, because sometimes at the end of the interview, you were so nervous throughout the whole thing, you kind of forgot what you said. So it's easier to evaluate your process and your responses in the moment. So they really liked that. The thing that we learned from them that really made us go back and question the design that we had originally created and amend it to make the product better is that their individual needs were the places where they struggled the most. Universal questions like, what are your strengths and your weaknesses, or why do you want this job, were easier for them than the questions that they had to answer about themselves. If there was a gap in work history, how would they explain that gap in a way that showed that it shouldn't be a concern for the employer moving forward? Talking about the desired job that they wanted and how they could compare their own skills to the requirements of the job. And then things like education and military history and experience with criminal justice were also elements that individuals with disabilities in that stakeholder feedback group brought up. So what we did, whoops, sorry, wrong way. we went back to the design of the system and we actually created a job application. It allowed individuals to practice that same online job application that many of the employers are requiring now versus the more traditional paper and pencil applications. But it allows them to put their own personal information in there, information about their work history, the position that they want, the schedule that they want. And then the interviewer, whose name is Molly Porter, actually changes the conversation based off of those individual needs. So if an individual applies for the cashier position, the questions that are asked during the interview are about the cashier position, versus if they're applying for a janitorial position, the conversations are different because the jobs are different. So we wanted to make sure that users were able to tailor that experience to their own history and what they were hoping to get out of the job. And then the last thing that the program included is the after action review, which gives summary feedback on how well they did during the conversation. That paired with the in the moment feedback that the on-screen coach gave with the thumbs up and the thumbs down, but help them evaluate and assess how they did overall and restart. So now I'd like to turn the program over to my colleague, Dr. Smith, who focuses on the evaluation of this training tool.
Thanks, Laura. Earlier in my career, I worked with Dr. Bell in SIMmersion to begin the evaluation of the job interview training featuring Molly Porter. And that work has followed me here to the University of Michigan. I started off at Northwestern. And essentially, now we have the Level Up Lab, where we work with SIMmersion, not only with the job interview training featuring Molly Porter, but also a newer tool that we adapted when partnering with the community. Laura, go ahead to the next slide. And so as Laura mentioned, a lot of this work was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the Kessler Foundation. I also have some work that was funded by the National Institute of Justice, where we do this work in prisons. And I do have a conflict of interest where the University of Michigan and I will receive royalties on the sales of this youth version of the job interview tool that we'll be talking about here today. Laura, go ahead and go to the next slide. And so after the development of the job interview training with Molly Porter simulation, as I mentioned, I worked with Dr. Bell's SIMmersion to evaluate the tool's initial efficacy across 5 randomized control trials that featured young adults with autism, adults with mood disorders, military veterans with PTSD, adults with schizophrenia, and adults with a history of substance abuse. The participants who were randomized to receive the job interview training completed approximately 15 virtual job interviews that lasted about 25 to 30 minutes each over the course of 2 weeks in a laboratory setting. And then across the various samples, we observed consistent outcomes related to improvements in job interview skill and employment. And in this slide, we see the results of the job interview performance. And so as our primary outcomes in the initial efficacy trials, participants completed 2 job interview role plays pre and post that were rated by coders who were blind to the group status. So they didn't know who was getting the job interview training and who was getting services as usual. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And then from this work, we followed our participants up 6 months later and found a significant increase in receiving a job offer for the adults with serious mental illness as compared to the who worked with the job interview training compared to the control group. And then we saw a similar effect in the young adults with autism who, for their outcomes, it wasn't just job offers, but that also included offers for internships or volunteer positions, so across all of those offer types. But again, we see a significant difference in receiving those offers by 6 months. And then based on that initial data around the efficacy of the tool, we sought and were awarded funding from the National Institute of Mental Health to adapt the job interview tool, job interview training with Molly Porter, to support transition age youth with autism. And so this study was designed using a 3-phase approach, where phase 1 included determining adaptations through soliciting community engaged feedback. Phase 2 required us to implement those adaptations, and then phase 3 was to evaluate those adaptations. And so going back to our efficacy work, this slide shows the translation of the working with Molly. So in the bottom left corner, you see number of completed Molly interviews. And so we found that was significantly related to post-test job interview skill performance, which in turn was related to receiving a job offer. And so that just shows that, you know, actually working with the tool was related to improved skills, and those improved skills was related to receiving that job offer. And so going back to our adaptations, our approach to working with the community was structured to first recruit 45 stakeholders, including 24 transition age youth with autism and 21 parents, teachers, employers, and adults with autism to basically use the Molly tool, interview with her, and get a sense of how we can adapt the tool to meet the needs of transition age youth. We then sought additional feedback from a community advisory board who reviewed the stakeholder feedback and then gave their own input. And then lastly, we had a scientific advisory board who sort of reviewed not only the stakeholder feedback, but also the community advisory board feedback, and then worked with the development team to finalize the adaptations to the tool. And so overall, the phase 1 adaptations that we identified included shortening the interview. You know, I mentioned that interviewing with Molly took 25 to 30 minutes. We shortened that process. We also increased the diversity amongst the characters, as well as increased the accessibility, engagement, and we're trying to identify ways to improve the acceptability, such as adding a social storytelling component and a token economy. And so here we see the new team that's part of the tool that includes Rita Munoz and Travis Bishop, who are the new job interviewers, and then Kendra, who's in the middle there, and she's your virtual job coach that provides that social storytelling component. And then here's just a quick slide that shows Travis within the job interview training interface. And that just gives us a sense of what that looks like on the screen. And you saw an image of Molly earlier that demonstrated that as well. And now we just call the tool virtual interview training for transition age youth. And so as we move into phase 3, we basically conducted another randomized control trial to evaluate the initial tool's initial effectiveness. And we did so by partnering with 5 special education programs where we were able to recruit 71 high school students with autism who were receiving pre-employment transition services already. And so we did the randomized trial to introduce the training to those students in the school setting. So my team trained the teachers to implement the tool in those settings. And so here we see that overall, the results are pretty consistent with that prior efficacy work that we did, but namely we see improved job interview skills in finding number 1 when we compare the 2 groups between pre-test and post-test. And in addition, our second finding was, this was something new that we added, but using some self-report measures, we identified that the trainees interviewing with Rita and Travis actually reduced their anxiety around performing the job interview over time. And then lastly, we see that the trainees received, when I say trainees, I mean those that practice with Rita and Travis. By 6-month follow-up, there was a significant difference in those who were able to obtain competitive and integrated employment by 6 months. And then here we see that in addition to our randomized controlled trial, we also found, we had some funding from the Kessler Foundation where we implemented the tool in more than 20 schools across the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Florida, where we trained the teachers remotely to implement the Rita and Travis tool. so that the students could all practice their job interview skills with the tool. And so this was a non-randomized, non-controlled study, but it was in 318 students with various that met various categories for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then let's see. And so what we found here was, I just go back to the slide. What we found here was that we observed more of a dose effect, where the students that practiced 1 to 5 virtual interviews by the 6-month follow-up, 26% of them had found employment. And then when we bumped that up to 6 to 14 virtual interviews that were completed, 38% of those students were able to find employment. And then for those students that completed 15 or more virtual interviews, they had 55% employment by 6-month follow-up. And the one thing I would note here is that in our efficacy work, on average, in the laboratory setting, the participants naturally just completed 15 or more interviews. And so when we kind of hold to that standard, we are seeing similar rates of employment. But as you can imagine, when you're implementing a tool in the real world setting, there's more variability in the uptake of the tool. Going to the next slide. And then here we see some results from the randomized controlled trial with the transition age youth with autism. So similarly to the other diagram that I showed, here we're also seeing that the number of completed Rita and Travis interviews is correlated with their post-test job interview skills assessed via role play. And that in turn is correlated with their competitive employment by 6 months. So again, we're seeing that translation from practice to skill to real world outcome. And then this is just a slide for our collaborators, both at the university partnership level, as well as our schools out in the community.
So I guess I'm gonna close us out here. So Dr. Smith and Laura talked about kind of where we started, where we've been, and I get to highlight where we're going. Throughout all the processes and development and design and evaluation that my colleagues spoke about, we engaged a lot of community stakeholders, be it individuals with disabilities, school systems, teachers, Department of Rehabilitation Services at the state level, vocational rehab services, and the list goes on. And what we really did is we listened extensively to what they were saying. And what we heard was they loved our tools, the results we're getting with obtaining employment, but what they really were interested in was how do we help individuals with disabilities sustain their jobs? That led us to pursue some new funding, and we were lucky enough to receive it from NIH recently to develop a new tool focused on work-based social functioning for transition age youth with autism. We're in the early stages of that work, and you know, I think throughout, particularly SIMmersion's tenure as a company, we really look to just develop meaningful relationships. And one of the meaningful ones we've developed recently has been with Dr. Sung. So we're super excited to be pursuing our new efforts with her. We are going to develop the new tool and evaluate it in a school setting using a hybrid effectiveness implementation trial with about 338 transition age youth with autism. So we're really excited about that. And another thing we heard was, you know, the SIMmersion's technology, as good as it is, you know, it can always be better. So recently we undertook a process with some consultants and some independent assistance, and we've brought the technology up to have the WACG AA compliance. So you can go to the next slide, Laura. And one other thing, we're always refining our process, right? We constantly want to improve and get better through innovation. And one thing we wanted to acknowledge was diversity and inclusivity within our products. So within our review process and the feedback we're obtaining on this new tool, we established a diversity advisory board to specifically focus and provide recommendations and feedback on our design and prototype with respect to race and gender diversity, inclusivity, information and inclusion as we build it. So the process is continually refining and moving on. And we can go to the next slide, Laura. And we don't totally know where we're going to go after this one, but we know we're going to keep working. But one thing we do know is we're going to continue to build the best products targeted at the end users using equitable input from technology, science, and stakeholders. And that's been really successful for us. And we're very proud of the work that we've done and the work that we're going to continue to do. So I will leave it there, and I think Matt is going to just conclude with one final remark. And thanks very much for everyone's time and attention, and to all the other speakers. It was wonderful to hear all the great information that was presented.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to share that, as a scientist, it's really important to find strong partners in the community. And for me, working with SIMmersion has been an absolute delight. It's not often you find a kind of a for-profit company that cares so much about who they're trying to help. And for us, when I was doing a lot of the early work, I gave dozens and dozens of these presentations on the findings in different settings. And consistently what we heard was, it's nice to get a job interview, but what's going to help us sustain that job? And, having partners like SIMmersion who's willing to listen to the community is just really great for, developing new technologies and assistive technologies to help persons with disabilities find greater equity in obtaining employment. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Chris said and what Laura said, that we're very honored to be able to present the work that we're doing here today amongst all of our esteemed colleagues. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Matt and Chris. So